Imagine a cathedral bathed in candlelight, a sea of nobles in jeweled robes, and at the very center of it all, a 6-year-old girl in a golden gown, too small for her crown, walking slowly toward a man nearly 5 times her age. This isn't a fairy tale. This is history. On November the 1st, 1396, the great bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out across London, not for war, not for peace, but for a royal wedding so surreal it feels almost impossible. Isabelle of France, still playing with dolls, was about to become the Queen of England. But behind the splendor of silk and stone lies a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and one child's silent suffering in the name of diplomacy. This is not just a tale of kingdoms and kings. This is the true story of a girl sold for peace, and the high price she paid for a crown she never asked for. Isabelle was born on November 9th, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the fourth daughter of King Charles VI of France, known infamously as Charles the Mad, and Isabeau of Bavaria, a queen both ambitious and controversial. Charles VI's descent into madness began in his 20s. During his episodes, he failed to recognize his wife or children, believed himself made of glass, and often ran through palace halls screaming about invisible enemies. France was thrust into chaos, ruled not by its king, but by feuding regents hungry for power. Meanwhile, Isabeau of Bavaria used her husband's illness to accumulate influence and wealth. Chroniclers of the era described her as cold, dissolute, and neglectful, even toward her own children. To her, daughters were not individuals but assets, chess pieces in a grand political game. Young Isabelle grew up in this fractured and dangerous court, surrounded by palace intrigue, war, and the looming specter of her father's madness. By 1396, the Hundred Years' War had ravaged France and England. Richard II, recently widowed and facing domestic rebellion, sought to secure peace with France and stabilize his reign. The French, led by the Duke of Berry, seized the opportunity. They proposed a marriage between Richard and little Isabelle, offering a massive dowry of $800,000 and a 28-year truce. For war-weary France, it was a deal too good to refuse. The cost: a 6-year-old girl, negotiations, cold and transactional, treated Isabelle not as a person, but as a high-value commodity. Some English lords hesitated, citing her extreme youth even by medieval standards. But Richard, desperate for allies and funds, agreed. Isabelle would be England's child queen. Her farewell at the Louvre was a political performance. King Charles, briefly lucid, wept as he blessed his daughter. Isabeau, ever the pragmatist, treated the departure as a well-executed business deal. Isabelle didn't fully grasp what was happening. She brought along a few toys, some favorite dolls, and a small dog. Her entourage included hundreds of nobles and guards, escorting this treasure across France and into England. Each English city she passed greeted her with grand celebrations. But Isabelle, overwhelmed and exhausted, often cried asking to go home. In London, Richard II staged one of the most extravagant weddings of the era. St. Paul's Cathedral was adorned with intertwined French and English fabrics. Thousands of imported candles bathed the space in golden light. Choirs sang in Latin and French. The king, though visibly uncomfortable, followed through. At 29, he was known as an art lover and a refined man deeply in mourning for his first wife. He treated Isabelle more as a daughter than a spouse, shielding her from court pressures and surrounding her with French tutors and comforts. Yet during the ceremony, Isabelle stood silently, confused and afraid. The Archbishop of Canterbury had to kneel to slide the ring onto her tiny finger. When declared queen, she didn't smile, only looked around, searching for familiar faces that were no longer there. For 3 years, Isabel lived a quiet life in England. Richard ensured she was well cared for, never forcing the marriage to be consummated. She had her own palace quarters, tutors, and a household staff devoted to her well-being. But in 1399, disaster struck. Richard was overthrown by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. The deposed king was imprisoned and eventually murdered. Isabel, only 10 years old, became a widow who had never been a wife. Her position at court became a liability. The marriage had not produced an heir, but the dowry had already been spent. Returning Isabel to France would mean returning money England no longer had. Henry IV kept her in comfortable captivity at Havering Castle, hoping to use her in future negotiations. But Isabel, now wiser and wounded, wrote heartbreaking letters to her family. "I write to you in tears," she pleaded, "for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." In 1401, after prolonged diplomatic pressure and one of King Charles VI's fleeting moments of clarity, Isabel was finally allowed to return to France. But the 12-year-old who arrived back in Paris was not the same child who had left. France was still torn by war and political instability. Her return was not a celebration, but an obligation. Even her own family viewed her as a burden. In 1405, at age 16, Isabel was once again used as a pawn, married off to Charles, Duke of Orleans, a sensitive young poet and nobleman. This time, something extraordinary happened. They fell in love. Charles was gentle, artistic, and adored Isabel. For the first time, she experienced affection that was not political in nature. They shared poetry, dreams, and mutual respect. But fate intervened again. In 1407, Charles was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt and would spend 25 years as a prisoner. Once again, Isabel was left alone. In 1409, Isabel gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Jeanne of Orleans. But complications from childbirth claimed her life shortly after. She was just 20 years old. Her death went largely unrecorded, a tragic contrast to the grandeur of her wedding at Saint-Paul's. Isabelle of France lived a life defined not by choice, but by sacrifice. Married at 6, widowed at 10, imprisoned at 12, remarried at 16, and a widow once more at 18. Used, traded, and ultimately forgotten. Her story reflects the harrowing fate of noble daughters in medieval diplomacy. She never truly had a childhood. She never truly had a life of her own. She was a child queen, crowned for peace, but condemned by politics. Isabelle of France never chose the crown that was placed on her head, never chose the borders drawn by kings, nor the loneliness behind palace walls. She was a daughter, a child, a soul sacrificed so that men could call it peace. Her story isn't just about the past. It's a mirror, showing us what happens when power forgets humanity. Crowned at 6, widowed at 10, forgotten by history, but not by us.